Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orca Books Co-op's virtual reading and discussion of the poetry of Adrienne Su, Martha Silano, John Sibley Williams, and Blas Falconer. We have the poet quartet here today to share their work and talk about their poetry with us. Our poets will be reading from their collections, and Peach State, Gravity Assist, The Drowning House, Scale Model of a Country at Dawn, and Forgive the Body for This Failure are also available here in store at Orca Books Co-op. After the reading, we'll have a discussion with our poetry panel, a friendly reminder to keep your mics muted most of the time. And without further ado, poets, I will give the floor to you, and I'd love to invite Blas to read. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So glad you guys could make it here on this Friday afternoon. I'm really glad to be going first so I get to listen to poetry afterwards and enjoy the reading. I don't like being in the middle of a reading because then I can only think about, what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to read from a new book that I have recently finished. I finished it last summer, I think, which means I'll probably keep tweaking it for, a couple of years. It's not scheduled for release until fall of 2024. So a nice long while. Which is, I don't know, I think it's kind of nice, actually. I can substitute poems, think about it. I can kind of let it go and return to it in a couple of years and revisit those poems. So anyway, so I'm going to read some of the poems from this book. It addresses fatherhood. For the most part, that's the recurring theme. And there are a number of different kind of aesthetics that I seem to be gravitating towards. There's my dog. I'm going to close the door. So I thought she might get loud. The first poem I'm going to read is called Pancreas. From the Greek, pan, meaning all or whole, and creas, meaning flesh. A gland, like a sponge, secreting fluids to regulate blood sugar, to break down. Common ailments include inflammation, pancreatitis, and cancer, abdominal pain, weight loss, jaundice. It's possible to live without one, my father says on the phone. A dryness in his mouth, his tongue sticking as he tells me what to expect if he's lucky. And all day, everything, no matter how small, makes me think of it, hidden deep inside me, weeping. The bee crawling in blossoms scattered on the glass tabletop, the sound of a pitcher filling slowly with water. See what's next. I've almost already forgotten what's in this book. How is that possible? But I have. Okay. Here's a poem I wrote at Community of Writers Workshop. Ron was there last summer. So I apologize for the repeat poem. It's called ¿Qué significa? And usually my poems are spare and lyric. And this one, I felt like the need to pivot and try something different. That'll happen when you have to write a new poem every day. And so I wrote this discursive poem at 3 a.m, after everything else kept failing. ¿Qué significa? I thought it'd be cooler here in late June, but all night I'm kicking off the sheets and pulling them back over my body in the stillness of my room, until I remember suddenly those summers as a boy lying in the twin bed with you. That was before the highway, when one needed to drive up and down the mountains to get from one side of the island to the other, and Salinas, where the fishing nets hung to dry in branches along the shore, and we swam in the clearing among the mangroves or rocked in a hammock behind the house where my father, my mother, and your father were born. still seemed untouched by America. Sometimes at the bakery, or with the woman who sold lottery tickets outside the restaurant, or as the men drove us in the back of their trucks past the sugarcane fields, not understanding a word or turn of phrase, a joke someone made, I'd ask, ¿Qué significa? But it was already over, or too hard to explain, you'd say. I grew homesick for English. One summer at the movies, you cried so hard it scared me, the screen lighting your wet face. One summer, sprawled out on the floor in front of the TV in our bathing suits, we began to wrestle, laughing until our hands, then our mouths moved across our bodies, driven by a force we let guide us. Then someone stopped, and we lay in the sunlit room, breathing hard. Someone must have gotten up and walked away. Someone must have made small talk until we could pretend it never happened. Quiero verte, you said on the phone years later, both of us now with children of our own. And when I made it back one day to the island, I drove to your house, knocking on the large door at the agreed upon time, but no one answered. The flamboyant trees were in bloom, their bright red blossoms scattered on the street, and it didn't take long to get back to my hotel, but I got lost. I'd never been to that part of the city, and so much had changed. Okay, where's the next poem? As I scroll down. This next poem was written, I wanted to write about my own father and his illness, dealing with pancreatic cancer, and then my son, and kind of, it made me kind of put fatherhood in perspective for me as well, and listening to my own son. And so I was reading this book at the time, and it seemed like a fitting door into this subject matter. It's called In the Book We Are Reading Together. In the book we are reading together, the father dies before the first sentence. Namdi didn't want to look at his body in the casket. We pass it back and forth, taking turns, our heads casting shadows onto the page. Early on, the father returns from the dead as a shadow in the street. Is it really him? When they speak, we speak the way we imagine they'd sound, angry or sad. Sometimes I get to be the son and you're the dad. Sometimes you sound the letters out until a word reveals itself new. You stare off as if you know how the book will come together. You look at my face as if you can see the sounds it makes. Sometimes you grow bored and want to stop. Sometimes you wonder if the father is gone for good. You yawn. It's getting late. We are coming to the last page, and I nod along. Soon we'll see where the story has taken us. Sometimes you want a story to last forever, and sometimes you just want to know how it ends. Okay, here's another one of the discursive poems. I'm kind of trying these out instead of the shorter lyric poems, which might be a little tougher, and also, in a reading to kind of grasp when you can't see it. I also don't like introducing poems, and when you read a lot of short poems, you have to talk a lot. So I'm grateful for these. This one is called Kindness. It might be the longest poem I've ever written, though it's not that long, but is in a sequence. And it's another discursive poem, and it's a little mean-spirited, but that's okay. Kindness. He's kind because he wants people to like him. Mary's mother said. The first woman in Italy to earn a PhD in chemistry, and whose family survived the war by hiding hens on the patio of their apartment. She knew I'd come out of the closet at 24, and loathing myself, saw any kindness an act of great charity for which I should be eternally grateful. So maybe she was right, but her insight became another reason to hate myself. Mary and I taught in Tatabánya, Hungary that year, where we earned $200 a month, but she'd lost her job and come to live with me in a small studio on the edge of town. That year, I met Mike and traveled as far as Miskolc, the other end of the country, to let him touch me, which was the first time I'd been touched by a man without feeling fear. That year, Mary lost so much weight that her thick hair started falling out. She'd run her fingers across her scalp and let the clumps fall to the floor. See? When we left, her hair grew back. She went to law school, but said that she wanted to get married, have a family more than anything else. In our mid-30s, I went to her house where she lived with her husband, a military pilot, and 2 kids. She was a judge. And our friend Ivy, who we'd known as long as we'd known each other, had come too. I believe that, constitutionally, you have the right to marry a man, Mary told me. But I vote for whomever lets me keep as much of my money as possible. She went on to say, slicing a piece of cheese for her cracker, how difficult it'd be to get along without her au pair, whose 2-year visa was ending and soon would have to go back to France if she didn't find an American husband. And would I consider it? Ivy looked embarrassed, and I stumbled in confusion in what I'd later recognize as anger to remind Mary that I was living with Joseph, a man I loved. We didn't talk again, Mary and I, until 2011, when she told me that Ivy had died, and was surprised to hear that I suspected it was why she was calling after so much time. I explained how a few months before, Ivy left a message to congratulate us about the adoption. I'm so happy, so happy for you both. And that she had cancer and hoped to beat it. But when she didn't answer my calls, I feared the worst. As far as Mary knew, Ivy hadn't told anyone else. She must have really liked you, Mary said to herself, it seemed, as much as to me. And I felt like I should say something kind in return, and took a deep breath, considering how to begin. Let me check my time. Okay, I have time for one more. So, I think I'm gonna read a poem called The Good Guy, which is toward the end, somewhere. Yeah, that's the right one. It's nice to have this chance to return to this book and think about it. Okay, here's the last poem. Thank you guys for listening, and I'm so excited to finish this so that I get to listen to everybody else. This is The Good Guy. We stood on the back porch in the late afternoon, crying hard but quiet so the kids wouldn't hear, and looked at each other. After, tired, we fell asleep on the couch, which we hadn't done in years. When we moved into this house, we found a garden, and that first summer I picked tomatoes, squash, my hands passing over what needed more time, what had fallen to the ground, rotting or half-eaten. When the season ended, we let the grass spread over the dirt, and whatever else was buried there. I woke up in the early evening to a sadness, like something I could point to, a painting you hung on the wall, a silver bowl you filled with coins from countries you might never see again. I could hear the boys playing in the next room. Now I get to be the bad guy, until one stopped the game to say, I'm hungry. Me too, the other said, and you got up slowly and made your way to the kitchen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you. I'd love to invite Martha, if you would like to read for us. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay? So I'm really excited to be here with reading with these three incredible poets. So it's just such an honor, and thank you to Orca Books for hosting us. It's wonderful. So I'm going to read some poems from Gravity Assist, which came out in 2019, and I was sort of doing some readings, and I think the last 6 of them were preempted by the pandemic. So it's sort of arrested development because it's now been 3 years since the book came out. I sort of can't believe it. So I'm just gonna read a few poems from each section, and I have a few new poems to finish out my time, and I need to make a note when I started so I don't go over. So this is called Bloodline, and it's Abecedarian. It's about my father. And so when I say Abecedarian, that means the first line begins with the letter A, goes all the way through to Z. Bloodline. Any day the floor will give. By the time he dies, the 50 dust-catching, hand-painted wooden roosters dragged from his sister's Miami condo will eke out a prayer for her final reclusive night when, fricasseed on booze, she dropped to the parquet ground, the arm not hugging the toilet, hugging her final jug of Smirnoff. In his hideaway office, reams of unsolved problems, just enough torsion equipment to tax the clay foundation. Kate, his older sister, same illness, racks and racks of labels on frocks, boxes of stylish pumps stacked to the ceiling. Mom had to clear off the bed before she could tuck us in. Nope, won't let me throw away a thing. Very attached. Okay, I say, but can't stop thinking of packing day, pulleys, trolleys, motion centers, vacuum tubes, clamps. Quietly, he's accumulated a dozen behemoth PCs, rheology from Rio, flow, soft bodies pressured to wince. Someone's got to want at least a gross of transistors, teaching materials on liquid to liquid transition. Urge him to toss just a few of these atoms and bonds. Very touchy. Wadded up a few ditto sheets circa 1966. Wow, did he go apeshit. Doesn't want anyone near it. Except for his diaries, those he's saving for you. Yeah, maybe you can use them to add a little zest to your poems. You're the writer, have at it. Well, Dad, love my dad. So, but he could be tough. All right, so this is called Instead of a Father. Instead of a father, a volcano. A girl puzzling through long division between eruptions. A girl working hard to discern the intervals between disturbances. It was a kind of having to duck from the pumice. It was like the chunk of anthracite in your third grade classroom, the one the teacher couldn't stop talking about. It was like the chained dogs at Pompeii. It was that pitch, one of the many greatest hits of the 70s. Steadfast, like breathing in the finest particles, the ones that lodge in your blood, like a cubic mile of ash and mud and rock, a seismic jolt followed by an explosion. It was like a heat surge scorching every eukaryotic cell, its Golgi apparatus, its smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and its rough endoplasmic reticulum, each eukernel singed. Well, things got worse with my dad as he got older. The dementia, what had been just mere mental illness, was full-blown dementia at the end of his life. And this poem I used for about a year before I wrote this next poem, Ode to Autocorrect. I kept track of every time autocorrect would do some crazy correction. And while I was visiting my father, this is one of the last times I saw him, it just, it turned incense to insane. It was just, it seemed like the autocorrect knew what it was doing. I had this feeling like, so I just really just took what autocorrect gave me and wrote this poem. Ode to Autocorrect. Because it changes O'Hare to oh hate, oh hate, oh hate, over and over, no matter how many times I retype it. Oh hate, like an American tune, an American fable, where you can enter an oh hate bathroom, take a selfie in the mirror, because your sister wants to see the pockets of your great American rhinestone jeans. Because on a street called Viewpoint, I get home becomes I get guns, off a road on a mission to kill every squirrelish pedestrian. Because he was packing, concealed, threatening to use his hands or feet. My feet. I am of a son of a birch, of a brick chatting with the devil, with God, with the listener not listening. Because he'd gone bonnets, his garden bounty of faded wine, his wife's linguine longing for a golden ear. So I took her to the botanical gardens in my getaway car, to a fruit on a vine, but the limes went lemur, the night to non-fat, the clear to catastrophic. Because driving away from the frogman croaking hypocrite, heavenly went down like a melting hedge. A gal gone hogtied, a fish crying, a tiger togetherness, flight or fucked, a heart stroked, racing to its vicarious carousel, a fungus lashed to a beam gone beleaguered. Because he will kill her, that's his plan, to kill us all. Cannot commit or commute, cannot debone his breath, can't take his acute paranoia, chalk it up to cute. Because this here's a Josie madhouse, a bedroom bedrock locked. Because boulevard morphed to bled, spirit summoned with a Ouija board. Because soap holder went love hen, though love had flown the calacanthus like the grilled portobellos messing with his vowels. Please, please, I pleaded to the pleading day. Because prayer is like a bread line, a penny for your exploded mind. Because lots of logs to you, Mom. Because so sorry went poem. Well, that took about 10 minutes. Wow, I think time goes fast. I think I should just read two more, move from the book to some newer poems. So I lost both of my parents in the 8-month period, and my mom during the pandemic when we were on lockdown. So thankfully, after I didn't get to say bye to her, but I finally got to go visit where she's buried, and that was super nice last December. I'm going to read, just these two more. So this is called Grief is a Planet, which is a line from a poem by Camille Rankin. Grief is a planet like Mars, the endless search for water, finding water, but it's frozen deep in the Martian ground. Is it water? Is it slush? Too salty to desalinate? Always looking for life. That's a constant, the same desire for one or both. For my parents to show up like the frozen water deep in the soil of Mars. Searching and listening. Water so clear you can see trees in it. Mistake the water for the trees. Listen, it's a water ouzel on the edge of a lake. Little dipper dipping, shaking out its wings. Under, up, under again. My siblings WhatsApping before I'm awake. Have you heard anything from mom? I think dad's who he would have been if he hadn't been nuts. I tell them I've seen our parents, not smoke, not a mirage or bird. They flew to me, black and flapping, two black swallows made of something I can't place, dissolved in a white and swirling mist. Who believes we could colonize Mars? Survive on a planet where storms kick up dust that sticks to everything, blocks out light for months. Who wants to live on a planet where you'd have to wear a grief suit, where it's colder than the South Pole, where the water you melt evaporates like ghosts? And I'm going to finish with this poem called I Love the World. And thanks again for hosting Orca Books, and I am also really excited to just relax and listen to our final two readers. I love the world, but now I know a mother can work in her garden for 10 hours, not know it's her last day alive. Now I know no one's there to deadhead the zinnias and the feverfew. Even though the world is filled with injured geese and gulls, millions of acres of smoldering trees, I still love cantaloupe, how it sits on the kitchen counter waiting for my spoon to scoop its firm and juicy flesh, sorry. Even after I saw a photo of my mother's casket draped with one of her mother's quilts, I still loved hearing about the field of white daisies down the road from her grave. The world is both the wheat plowed under to make way for strip malls and the sunset like spilled orange juice above a gray lake. Joy resides in the mountains of styrofoam and Ziplocs, while sorrow suffuses my mother's backyard, its cardinals and finches, its hummingbird perched in a plum tree that lost all its branches in a terrible storm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. Thank you. Adrienne, I'd love to invite you.
Thank you, Socorro. And just so wonderful to hear you, Martha and Blas. I'm looking forward to hearing John. And you've both made me sort of rethink what I'm going to read. Themes emerge. Fathers. I wrote Peach State really sort of anticipating the loss of my dad, and it's sort of a celebratory book, and it's a book based on place. It's very much about Atlanta. But I think I was driven to write about Atlanta because I knew that I was going to lose my dad there, and I have now. So he sometimes appears in the book, but often I'm just kind of in this mode of wanting to remember throughout it. So I will maybe just read one poem that overtly sort of mentions him, and then I'll just read some other poems. And yeah, that's it. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a poem I rarely read because it has a little bit of context, but I think that you don't really need the context. It's called The Chow Mein Years in Atlanta. And what I can tell you is that I got the idea for it, sort of thinking about this idea of when Chinese food in America was limited and simple. People could just kind of refer to it as chow mein. Like that was before you got all the different regions. And so it just made me remember that time. What do I miss about the chow mein years? My mother picking me up from school. My father doing repairs or just being near. I didn't enjoy the neighbor's terror of what we might serve from carton or bowl. What I miss about the chow mein years is whispering jokes in my best friend's ear during church as we tried not to howl. My father, repairing the attic or cellar, was working more than he made it appear so that some in Fujian might escape state control. I do not miss from the chow mein years being asked to explain the poo-poo platter or the textbook sketch of the mongoloid. I missed my father being healthy and near, my mother frying rice with hot dog slivers, and none of us knowing what we were called. What I would ask of the chow mein years is my father repaired, and both of them near. These are poems that often celebrate food. So I'm going to read one that, let's see, yeah, a food we all know, instant ramen. Because the house was conceived by an architect who hadn't cooked his own meals, the box dwelled vertically in the broom closet, whose shoji panels, designed for elegance, slid aside to reveal a space so narrow, our perpetual case of Sapporo Ichiban shouldn't have fit. Yet the supply seemed infinite, taking care of all who came home hungry. Broth, an egg, a handful of spinach, giving it dignity enough for a meal or a bridge to a meal. It soothed us as children, sick or well. Always there on short notice, it saved us from takeout, saw both parents through days of grading and bills, weekends of yard work. Neither junk nor an emblem of struggle, it made no one fat. Later, when I met it in public, saw it mocked, I wanted to defend it, show it decked out with Napa cabbage slivers, nori flakes, bright green peas, but was taken aback, less by the commonness, more by the disdain, as if ramen were a stage one grows out of, mythic years of cooking on a hot plate, studying late, not having found true love. I am ashamed to say I did not stand up. I let everyone mock it, even mocked it myself. Grease with a side of MSG. I forgot who I was, young and hungry, sliding aside the shoji in search of transformation, in search of energy. And let's see. I'm going to read a distinctly Atlanta poem. This is called Personal History, and it has a little note about the place it's about. Many people have heard of it. Recently, it's Stone Mountain Park, which is just outside Atlanta. It is Georgia's most visited tourist destination. And the most distinctive thing about it is this sculpture on its sort of smooth side. I mean, it's been kept clear to display this sculpture. It shows Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. And it's massive. It's on the scale of Mount Rushmore. The carving was begun in 1923, stalled out in 1928, and then kind of spurred by the Brown v. Board of Education decision and the Civil Rights Movement, that project resumed in 1964, and the carving was completed in 1972. Personal history. The world's largest Confederate monument was too big to perceive on my earliest trips to the park. Unlike my parents, I was not an immigrant, but learned in speech and writing to represent. Picnicking at the foot and sometimes peak of the world's largest Confederate monument, we raised our cokes to the first Georgian president. His daughter was 9 like me, but Jimmy Carter, unlike my father, was not an immigrant. Teachers and tour guides stressed the achievement of turning 3 vertical granite acres into art. Since no one called it a Confederate monument, it remained invisible, like outdated wallpaper meant long ago to be stripped. Nothing at Stone Mountain Park echoed my ancestry, but it's normal for immigrants not to see themselves in landmarks. On summer nights, fireworks and laser shows obscured with sparks the world's largest Confederate monument. Our story began when my parents arrived as immigrants. No, I think I forgot. I said I was going to read one poem with my dad in it, and now he seems to be in them all. I think we don't even really know that we're obsessed with something. So whatever that tells us. I will read, I think maybe one more poem from Peach State, and then maybe one new one. This is called, and the book is full of Chinese restaurant poems. And so this is the final poem in the book. It's called An Hour Later, You're Hungry Again. For the table to be round, for the teapot to be bottomless, for your elders to compose the menu, for the waiter to recite the order back, for the fish maw soup to be ladled at the table, for red vinegar to bloom in it, a submerged flower, for the bright lights and immaculate tablecloth, for the extra order of Singapore noodles, for the white blossoms on Chinese broccoli, for your mother to warn you which sauces are hot, for your brother to turn the lazy Susan just when you need it, for the cloth napkin to slide to the floor, for rice in a hexagonal lacquered box, for the hill of bones on your tiny plate, for the wash and dry packet after the lobster, for the sea bass to give up its spine without resistance, for your aunt to serve you nameless meats you love, for your grandfather to assign everyone a favorite dish incorrectly, for the shrimp to have expressionless eyes, for your grandmother to murmur thank you as everyone serves her, for the owner to insist on calling your father professor, for the ice water you requested but forgot to drink, for the film of oil on your last grains of rice, for the gift of red bean soup with the oranges, for the numbers on the check in Chinese penmanship, for the leftovers in their cartons in tied plastic bags, for the Chinese newspaper rack in the vestibule, for night to have fallen while you were eating, for ginger and scallions to infiltrate the dreams from which you will wake in the only home you know. And I'm going to end with a really short poem, and I'm just so thrilled that Martha is here because I wrote this in response to a prompt in her book, The Daily Poet. Not only that, but you opened your reading with an abecedarian, and it was the prompt that says write an abecedarian that has only 26 words. So every word must follow the ABC pattern. I would never have done this without you, Martha. So here it is. It's called 26 on 2020. Anti-bat committees developed early. Functioning grown-ups hoarded ibuprofen, jerky, kayaks, lentils, Merlot. Newspapers ostracized pangolins. Questionable rulers silenced teachers. Underdogs vied with xenophobes. You zoomed. Thank you so much for listening, and just such a joy to be with all of you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, everybody. John, I'd love to invite you to complete our reading, and then I'd love to speak with all of you a little bit. So John, I pass the floor to you.
Oh, thank you. That was so beautiful. My goodness. That's funny too, that in hearing all this, it made me want to change up some poems. I think everyone was doing that. So I'm like, oh, you never know, right? It's like, oh, should parenting poems, cultural poems, what should I do? So that's really interesting. And then also grief poems and parental grief poems, Martha, too. So it's like, wow, okay. There's so many themes that I often work with that were just kind of getting thrown out before me. So I was like, oh, so I had changed up a lot of my little tags here for what poems to read. But I do like to start, if I may, every poem, excuse me, I always start every reading with the same short poem in dedication to my mother, who, passed away about 6.5 years ago, just before my kids were born, unfortunately. And I believe I was told she read to me every day in the womb. So maybe that's why I started writing at a young age. So I like to start this for her. So this poem is called Death is a Work in Progress. My mother says, fox, while gesturing toward an old red wagon abandoned in our yard for decades. Fox, a word so cavernous, her entire body vanishes into it. Body of misfiring electrons, scattered images, no contexts. Body that is mainly just a body now. No other animal knows how to be this incomplete. I think if you were a fox, coyotes would have eaten you by now. But I say, yes, Mom, I'll climb into that fox and let you pull me through the high grass one more time. So similar to you, Martha, with her losing, or losing her faculties in the last year or so. So moving from there, move into some other stuff. So I'm going to read just two poems from my book, The Drowning House, that came out in January. There's about a half dozen poems in this that speak directly to what I did. Was I would take a historical figure, generally someone who'd been through a lot of suffering, and then sort of, I guess you could say, pair them with an artist. So try to tell the one person story through imagery from an artist. So in this case, it's Emmett Till, Edward Hopper. In your mouth, 1,000 unpainted churches, steeples snapped off like baby teeth in an apple, rusted bells trying so hard to ring, ringing, crows along your restless edges where clapboard meets sky and storm. The sky is always storming. Skin can be its own broken republic. Everywhere, overgrown rail tracks and a few white people who don't know what to say to each other. Not anymore. Truth is married to the surface of things. The surface is a lighthouse overlooking wreck after wreck. No ships here anymore. Nothing left to cradle and swing safely into harbor. All sorts of things swing. All sorts of women sit on the knife's edge of a bed, half naked, looking out a half naked window. All sorts of men are tossed over bridges after whistling a little tune. Come back, crows, bells, edges. In you, let the night see its face. So yeah, every single image in that is directly from an Edward Hopper picture. But the thing that motivated me there is, as much as I love his work, it's always like, wow, there are just a lot of very melancholic, very emotionally distanced white people in his images. And I was trying to find a context for why these people, all of them, whether they're pumping gas and looking blankly at a building or not looking at each other or staring out a window, even though there's someone in the room with them, why are they doing that? The poem was to try to find a context for that. So yeah, just one more from this book. I often try to bring history into the present, or potential lineage into the present, especially given my privileged status in this country, given my race and gender. So one of the things the idea of wondering what my lineage may have been like. So this poem is called "The Dead Just Need to Be Seen, Not Forgiven." That old man in the photo our family never talks about, known best for tracking runaway slaves. Tonight, we drag him from the basement up these loose wood stairs and set out a plate of salted cabbage and rabbit. So long since I've asked why the empty chair at our table. With all the warmth the body has to give, we give up on measuring the darkness between men. Dust and dusk enter and are wiped from the room. The names we call each other linger luminous and savage. Still, that tree I used to hang tires from holds tight to its dead centuries. The light swinging from its branches we call rope-like, which implies there's no longer rope. Tonight, we'll wash the burnt out stars from his hair and all the crumbs from his beard. The misfired bullet of his voice we let burn as it must. Now, I have absolutely no idea if my lineage involves people like that, but I do like to try to explore my privilege in whatever ways possible in poems. So hopefully no one in my family was ever like that 4 generations ago, but they certainly could be. So moving to just a couple poems from the book that just came out this past month. So this poem is taken from, maybe some of you have done this in school, I think it was middle school for me, where we had butterflies that we had in science class that we had to dissect and study. So this is called A Careful Study, Post-Mortem. No matter how many pins hold it down, the wings tremble. In your mind, still attempting flutter, flight. Like any child, terrified, every body is part yours. Even this strange mess, speckled black and gold, like midnight in the stars that define its edges. That there are edges at all hurts. Shouldn't the dead carry less weight, less expectation of awe? The pages begin to fill themselves. Measurements, comparisons, organs so small, you're not sure all interiors aren't ash. Like what rests, useless and cooling, beneath the fire your father last night showed you how to light. Mostly, he said, so you won't keep asking when your mother will return. All right. So just a quick more here. Okay, so in this next poem, there are 3 words that some people might not know: Minidoka, Manzanar, and Harmony. Those are 3 Japanese internment camps during World War II. Those are the ones that my wife's grandmother was pretty much raised in. And so therefore my children are half Japanese. And so that comes up in this, but I know a lot of people probably in this day and age don't know those names. So this begins with a brief quote from Langston Hughes, which is, "Today you will write about lights." And the poem is titled, "Our Pasts Like Lighthouses." I saw the sign scuffed and hooked over a boarded up door frame, freed from meaning only open or closed, doctor or butcher. Just a beautifully blank face gone all impartial and true. Each brick shattered window its own cathedral, its own eye. Finally, with history holstered, the barrel but lukewarm, the fossils of fallen stars have a chance to shine again, to be dusted off and to dust our future ancestors. My daughter, for example, how little her skin resembles mine. How if this were 1944, she and her brother would be displaced in Minidoka or Manzanar. Harmony, harmony. How she loves to say that word without the weight of context. How, like a lighthouse, she scans every goddamn corner of her safe little sea in search of some wreck to save. To guide back into harbor. Today, it's my heart. Love, thank you for that. And for this rotted old wooden sign, briefly, we will leave our names on. I always feel a little, odd reading some of these poems that I wrote, a couple of years ago. Since the book came out this year, they were written probably a year and a half ago or so, because one of my children has come out as transgender since. So I actually have 2 daughters. So I kind of feel weird when I reference boy and son in some of these poems, but that's how the poems are written. So, so if I may, I'm just going to read. I'm going to close just one more poem. So this final poem is called Object Permanence. Everything's still here, even after hidden behind the world's back, stolen from view, presumably erased from existence. Like a loved one you have no photograph to grieve. Like that red wagon my father broke and scrapped and said I had only imagined dragging through our garden, which once, and therefore still, throbbed the morning green. If leaving infancy behind has taught me anything, it's never assumed the disappeared cannot return. If what I've lost over the years is a lesson, it's that nothing returns in its original form. See, my mother would say, how the pale blue ball I've thrown up into the sky is now a moon, gorgeously unattainable. Please see me like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, everyone. It's really nice to have the 4 of you here and see you support each other, and also the inspiration that you guys have taken from each other in sharing just like what texts that you're teaching of each other's, and how you've been inspired by prompts. I have a few questions kind of inspired by everyone's work, but they're directed to all 4 of you. Blas, as you were reading, there are 2 lines in 2 different poems that I really enjoyed. That it was there's a line, "It's over or too hard to explain," and then "confusion later recognized as anger." And I was thinking about the beauty of poetry, that allows the ability to say multiple things at once, or to really load lines. So I was wondering if you could speak to the process of how you craft those lines when you are exploring multiple things but saying it in one breath.
That's a great, that's a great question. We all come to poetry with different, aims, and not every poem has the same aims, right? But I do find myself often coming to poetry to understand something that isn't quite clear to me, something that's too complex for me to comprehend entirely, maybe because of contradictions and what have you. And so I think that might be what you're picking up on is the meditative aspect of poetry writing often for me, and that's to understand the nuances in a moment and those kinds of contradictions. And so, for example, like I don't remember what the quote was exactly, but in that situation with Mary in the poem Kindness, like it was this, and then later I realized it was that. This is how I had it responded to in the moment. But I feel like when I'm writing the poem, I'm trying to kind of really kind of slow everything down and look at that moment and understand how I was feeling and at the time, and all the kind of those kinds of nuances. So anyway, I think that's just kind of what poetry is kind of meant to me is primarily. And so that's, I think, what you're picking up on.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from all our poets, just what are you thinking about when you're crafting a line, and are there times where you want to say multiple things at one time, or do you slow down and focus on a singular thing?
I guess no one's saying anything, so I guess I will. Everyone's staring at each other. Oh my, I don't know if it's just the way my brain works or what it is, but I never focus on one individual thing at the same time. I can't. None of my poems have just one theme. None of my poems are overly narrative. I tend to leap. And I kind of Robert Bly's classic leaps there. And part of it for me is just the idea of, I try to follow the connections that my brain is making between things. So like I'll have a poem that maybe it starts with a certain kind of image, and then internally, for some reason, my brain makes a connection, let's say, between that and being a parent, or let's say and then that might bounce to the idea of one of my children's, my child's gender changed fairly recently. And then that might remind me of something involving some, maybe some sort of, historical racial struggle, or, and as my brain makes those connections, instead of just barreling forward with what quote unquote I thought the poem was going to be, I kind of just follow my own internal connections. And then I just feel like my purpose is to try to write it in a way that others can take those leaps also with me, as opposed to, so I never know what a poem's going to be, what it wants to say, until the very last word is written. I have no idea until the very, very end.
I'll just say, I go into a trance, so I just completely let myself completely lower my expectations, which is the line from William Stafford. He just said, "You're having trouble, you're blocked. Just lower your expectations." And I just, and then I just let it all out on the page. I don't usually worry whether it's good or not. I just go on the riff, and similar to John, there's a lot of leaps and purposeful, surreal sort of moving in all directions. And then I figure I'll fix it later. I walk away from it. The longer I can not look at it, the easier it will be to revise. If I try to revise the same day or the next day, it'll be a ton harder because I won't have that distance. So, but yeah, it just fires. And yeah, I think it was Robert Frost who said, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader." So it's same as John. I love being surprised at the end and having no idea that's where my poem was going. So.
Since you said crafting a line, Socorro, I think I try not to think of it as crafting. in that stage that Martha just described of just kind of expecting little. I don't even expect it to look like a poem. It looks like that horrible thing we hope our poems are not, which is prose with line breaks. And so I'll just kind of do that. I'll just sort of let myself write prose with line breaks and figure there's no craft here. It's just a mess. And my expectations are extremely low. Sometimes they're so low that I'll just give up, right? And so that's too low. You have to get to some point where you trust yourself. But then I think the craft part comes later when you let yourself think about how it might be confusing. You want just that right degree of mystery, but you don't want to be so opaque that people just don't know what's going on. So I do sometimes depend on the constraints of rhyme or some other aspect of form to disrupt my own tendency to say the sensible next thing, which is usually that sort of obvious and boring next thing. So if I throw in, some requirement to repeat a word, then I'm allowed to say that logical thing.
Thank you. And Adrienne, when you were reading, you had said something, and you were talking about in regards to your father and how he showed up in multiple poems, and you had said, we don't know when we're obsessed with something, which I loved. And I had thought to ask all of you, of course, and also I was thinking about Peach State and the relationship with food and like the human body. And do you find that you understand the theme of a collection as you write, or are you creating poetry and then over time you look back and in retrospect there has been a theme?
I did set out with a theme with Peach State, but I don't always. I think I had been forced to say what I was going to do. I mean, everybody who ever applies for a grant or requests a sabbatical from your institution has to sort of say, I'm going to do something. I tried saying, I'd like to write some poems, and they kicked it back and said, you have to say that. So I did develop a plan, and it helped. But yeah, I didn't know what was I didn't know there was so much I wanted to say about American Chinese food. So there were plenty of surprises. The no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader principle still applies.
Thank you.
I can jump in talking about that. I think I have the same obsessions now that I did when I first started writing poetry. The themes of kind of exile and alienation, and they find different stories or ways of expressing. I find different ways of expressing those things. When I was writing my first book, I was trying to figure out how to write a poem. And so I wrote those over many, many years, and then I had to struggle to figure out how they would all work together. And since then, I usually am not a fast writer, but it takes me about 4 or 5 years to write enough poems that might fit into a book. And then because I have, this obsession, they generally speak to one another in a way that makes sense. It's just figuring out the order. I think for me, what I've thought about more than anything from book to book is how can I draw on different devices or poetic modes so that I'm not writing the same or narratives even. So I'm not writing the same poem now that I was writing, 25 years ago. And so what I tell my students and what I often think is that all these different devices are like muscles. And if you don't use them, they start to atrophy. And so I start to think, okay, wait, I've been kind of lazy with syntax lately. Let me, read my touchstone poets who I think are incredible with syntax or the conceit or the long line or whatever it is. And then I just, and I kind of find out how that device can speak to my obsession. And then I just kind of, so that's for me is what keeps it fresh and new, and hopefully for a lifetime.
I guess I could say my process is incredibly similar to Blas's, very, very similar. Yeah, in just terms of writing, and then some voice inside tells you, I think I have enough, I feel like I have enough. And of course, in the weeding through process, I mean, you're going to go from, or at least me, would go from say 100 and over 100, say between 100 and 125 poems to winnow it down to 75, or 100 poems to winnow it down to the 60 or something like that, because not everything's going to fit thematically, or some might be kind of redundant with each other, exploring the same thing in a similar voice, not enough variety of certain things. And so yeah, so generally, as much as I hate killing trees, once it gets to that point, I have to print them all out, and I start making stacks, and I make notes in red in the corner of each one about what some of the themes are, or imagery in the corner, and I start making piles all over the entire floor. And so it turned out that I ended up creating 2 collections at the same time, these 2 that came out this year, because of that. As I collected them by themes, I realized, oh, wait a second. So they all get, like you said, Blas, I'm still haunted by the same things as when I was 20, when I started writing poetry. But at the same time, to keep things fresh, it's like, okay, so I have some prose poems, and I have some poems that are ekphrastic, and I have this and I have that, and some long line poems, some short multi-section, and then trying to figure out where those might fit. Like it's always so tough. Like, do you group them structurally? Do you group or do you want that sprinkled out? You group them thematically and things like that. So that's why I've often found writing tons and then trying to collect at least 1, if not 2 books at the same time, just to make sure that I have enough to pull from, that it feels like one experience.
Well, during the pandemic, I've written 2 books, but I was reading one sort of about like fires and all the horrible things happening with our planet, and then I have the deaths of my parents, and that brought me to writing about my childhood and stuff. But the last time I read, I was reading from both, and someone in the audience said, it's time to mush it together. And so that's really exciting. I've done it before, like the mush of astrophysics and motherhood ended up working. And so I'm falling out of love with enough of the poems that I'm even able to see that maybe the eco grief, the climate grief, will mesh nicely with this loss of my parents. So we'll see. I might just have 1 manuscript. So
Thank you. And eco grief, I have not heard that combination of words before, and it feels very apt. So thank you. Thank you for teaching me that phrase from my brain. So Martha, when you were reading, I was thinking about the Abecedarian, and I was wondering, like, when you write, do you begin with like the form or the shape, or do you write and then discover the form? And then there's a small follow-up question there. If you do both, what's the difference between when you begin with text and then are shaping a form versus when you start with a form and the form and shape influences the text that appears?
goodness. So I do try forms all the time. Just say, hey, I'm going to try sonnets for a while, or I'm doing pantoums right now. And I wrote 2 villanelles this year I finally think that, might be any good. But your question about like, when do you know? For me, most of the time it's intentional when I sit down, or very soon after I start a poem, I realize this is but yeah. And otherwise it's all free verse. I really do think overall I'm intentional about it. Like I'm writing a guzzle right now, and it's all guzzles all the time for, a few weeks. And then I'm so relieved when I'm out of the form and I can just write a free verse poem. So that's how it works.
Was that question for all of us?
Yes, sorry. Yes, yes.
Everybody's kind of waiting for who's next. I usually start with the poem and then let the form kind of reveal itself. Although with that abecedarian, I was obviously responding to a prompt. But I find that sometimes that big mess that is the early draft has the glimmer of the shape of something received. And I think it's just a matter of practice. That you learn to look at that blurt and figure out where there might be some order in it. So for me, it's more that I kind of look at the material and hope that a form will emerge.
I was going to call on you, Adrienne, because I wanted to hear your answer. I think maybe because I think I approach poetry and form similarly, where I'll start to write something and I'll get a sense of, is this, I mean, it really depends on the subject matter and the tone and, is this overflowing? Like, am I trying to give this sense of someone being overwhelmed, or is it somebody who's so struck by something that there's a spareness to it, and that I can kind of suggest a kind of almost out of body experience. So I think as I'm writing and I start to sense the tone, then I start to gravitate towards different devices. And I think Adrienne was kind of speaking to this, that you start to recognize how, like, oh, this feels sonnety, like it's shorter, it's lyrical. It's like there's a sense of longing, there's a sense of paradox or irony or whatever, and like so then you start to. But I don't feel obligated to make it 14 lines or have a rhyme scheme or a kind of meter. I can if I feel like that's helping, but I can be sonnet-like. I don't feel obligated to that. Yeah. So I teach a forms class in our graduate program, and I think it's the most important class I teach. And I tell them it's not so that you can check the villanelle box, which, Martha, I've never written a villanelle that is any good ever, and so kudos to you. I say it's because they help you to think about the devices and how they encourage certain kinds of modes or poems. What does the sestina invite? And what does it resist? What does the villanelle resist? And what does it invite? Or the pantoum, which kind of often invites indecision or contradiction or whatever. So I'm really interested in how form helps students to understand the relationships that different devices have with one another and how they encourage certain kinds of poems. And so, yeah, so I guess there's often that dialogue between the content and the form, and I just kind of let them speak to one another until it's over. So anyway.
I have absolutely no idea what I'm supposed to add to all of that. That kind of covers all the bases. I mean, yeah, I also very rarely go into it. Very rarely going into knowing what the form is going to be beforehand. The only times I've done that is, yes, if it's sitting down and it's like, yes, I want to experiment with a villanelle, with a pantoum. And I have also never written a good villanelle. I think pantoum and guzzle are the only two that I've done a couple okay ones. But that's more of an experimentation in a way, right? And then sometimes I'll know in advance of the prose poem. I have an entire collection of books that's just prose poems. So I knew that was going to be the case. But apart from those specific instances, yeah, it's hard to know. I like the way that I think Blas had said something about it. This is sonnety, or, it's kind of that feel where it's like, this feels like maybe couplets. This feels like maybe it should be a bit more experimental and scattered across the page. It needs more white space. So, and you mentioned tone too. So a lot of it is tone, or for me, the idea of breathing room. I at least for me, and that's kind of why I read so slowly too. I feel like, especially if you're taking a lot of leaps, if it's less narrative, then I find it's helpful for as a reader myself, to see some white space so that things aren't, if you have fairly divergent ideas or themes in the same poem, I enjoy, as a reader, some white space, some breathing room, so that I can take in an image, for example, digest it. I mean, it's only that split second, but digest it and then move on to the next one. Whereas if there are longer lines and a lot going on in each line, then there's a bit of a scattered aspect to me as a reader. So I tend to not clutter the page too much. But again, yeah, it totally depends on what the poem seems to be telling you. And usually within a first, usually within 3 or 4 lines, I think you begin to understand, maybe not what the poem's about, but you already kind of get a sense, right, after years of writing. You get a sense of, okay, this is going to be in couplets. I could just tell. But
Thank you. Thank you so much. And John, I'm glad you brought up breathing room, because as you were reading, it's so interesting to be able to see the poet read aloud and the cadence that you brought to your work. And I was wondering, do you read aloud as you write? And if so, what influences the auditory cadence have when you are working with your text?
oh my goodness, yes, I definitely do. That is a major part for me of the whole composition process. And since I don't compose alone, like many people do, some people have offices and they sit in them and they can just write. And I have kids, I have a dog, and so I actually write at my local cafe. All 4 of my last books have been almost all of it, either written at a park or at my local cafe. That you have that little hum in the background, that little wordless hum of people talking, that kind of thing. That helps me focus. So I look like a crazy person because I don't read it in my head. I have to read it out loud. It's a different experience. I'm sure we all know that. You have to hear the words. So I just sit there talking to myself for hours and hours and hours on end every day, and I look crazy. But for my process, I know this is going to be very different than everyone else's, but I don't actually edit. I've never edited a poem. I don't edit afterwards. It's the polar opposite. Everyone tells you pour everything on the page, but I can't do that because I don't have anything to say. The thing that the poem wants to say, it's going to tell me when it's ready to come in. So I don't pour things on the page. I edit while I go. So it's not like there's no editing. It's not Jack Kerouac's school of disembodied poetics or anything. quite the opposite. Every word is wrong. But for me, like, partly because I read out loud, that's why I was thinking of it. I start at the beginning. Let's say I have 2 lines, and I read those lines out loud to myself over and over and over again until the next line comes to me. Then I start at the very beginning, read those first 3 lines till the next line comes to me. Read the first 4 lines till the next line comes to me. And I do that over and over again every single time, which I think is hopefully why I'm not terrible at kind of the sonic nature of the poems, and which is why it's much easier. I feel it's easier for me to memorize a lot of my poems. Most of the ones I just read, I had my eyes closed for. Just because there's that sonic nature to them. And it's because I read them out loud over and over and over and over again while I write them, to the point that sometimes when a poem is done, I've already memorized it because I've read it out loud so often. And I know that's the opposite of everyone else, almost everyone else, right? Because you want to pour everything on the page, then find a shape for it. But I'm weird, I guess, in that if I don't feel like, let's say the very first line is what I need it to be, sonically, visually, the beats, whatever, if the line 1 isn't what I want it to be, I can't write line 2. That's my worst writer's block, is if I'm not happy with a line, I can't move on to the next one. So there's no drafting. I just have to do it all at once in one sitting. So yeah, so that's why I think the sonic quality so much. And then I just read toward the sonic quality, which is why I pause so much. And I'm also an East Coaster by birth, a Bostonian originally. And when I moved out to Oregon 12 years ago, everyone told me to slow down when you talk and walk and everything else. So I began to realize, no, I gotta just pause, deep, long breaths. And I don't know, I feel like that really helps with a lot of poems. People are always just like, oh, your images are tripping over each other, when I first moved out here, when I was reading out loud. So yeah, just kind of slow and steady, I guess. But I can't imagine it, because poetry is music in so many ways. And I know people just say that, but I think it is music. The way that you read a poem, it's a performance, even if you're just sitting there like we all are, not doing anything with our bodies. It is a performance, and there's inflection, and there's pausing, and deep breaths you can take, and you can get emotional at one point and then more distanced at another one. And you can do all that without doing anything, just the tempo of your voice. So yeah, that's just kind of part of it, I guess, for me.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about other people's experience with cadence and the sonic life of a poem.
Well, I'll say I'm same as John. I can kid myself and think I don't have to read it aloud. And at some point, I remember that I haven't. And it is just, that's when I catch so many things, because you can't say that. That's terrible. That's, and so, yeah, I'm up in my office and everybody's used to it, but most of the time people don't hear me. But that's when I really catch stuff, when I finally, John's doing it from the very beginning, but I think I can get away with it. And then no. And so it is, I just know when I it'll be kind of like, no, I can't say that. And then I know I have to fix it.
I'm reminded of my amazing professor, Phyllis Levin. He used to always say, if it doesn't sound right, it isn't right. But you haven't found the right, you're not saying what you need to say because it doesn't, because the way it sounds doesn't sound right. And I kind of similarly, I often read something out loud, but I feel like my poems are coming from a really quiet voice inside me. Like I have to shut like the chatter in my head to let this other voice come up. And so I find like I'm often whispering to myself and plugging my own ears because then it's like you can hear it in your skull, the sounds you can, and I like that. And I also think about meter, and I think about the taut line, I think about all those things, but there's also a kind of there's also the music of inflection. There's this music of, I think about my mother. My mother is Puerto Rican and spoken Spanish. And I remember, my father never spoke Spanish. So I remember listening to her and kind of just getting lost in the way she would say something very simple, the simplest statement, and how much character could be infused in a statement. Humor or wit, something biting wit. It could be like she could say something about my dad and be like an insult, but like if I translated it literally, my dad wouldn't know. But like just like but she said it in this tone or in this way, and so to me, so much of my poems, I imagine I'm speaking to somebody. It might be to myself, but and then I start to think about. So I think about inflection, I think about the line, I think about how that kind of drapes over the sentence, the music of the sentence, but it also influences like pacing. How much of something do you say? When do you cut something short so that it kind of, it's like you like trip and the reader has to move forward. So there, so much of music is such a complicated metaphor for what we're doing. It's not just meter. It appears in the poem or works in the poem in so many kind of magical ways. So so I think reading aloud to myself and kind of hearing it in this, like it's a part of me is speaking to me, is the way I can sense. That's too much. You're explaining something or you're giving something away. Like if you don't say that, you're hinting at it, and then there's a little bite to it, or there's anyway. So like Martha and John are saying, the reading out loud tells me so much more about the poem than my like conscious mind even gets when I'm reading it.
I love what you said about I can hear it in my skull. I am that person who just goes into a place of silence and can't write in a cafe. I have a poem about not being able to write in a cafe. And I think it's in part because I'm usually like searching for just that right word. And if somebody walks up and says like, do you want another cup of coffee? I will lose the whole thing and be furious and frustrated. So I sort of need that emptiness. And I don't tend to read aloud to myself, but I'll talk to myself while I'm making the decisions. And I'm also a person who doesn't read well with any noise. although I've spent many years with like children and pets around me, and it's been one of those things where I've learned how I can read the muse with noise now, but can't read poems, can't write. And to me, and Blas, you just described this too, that there's so much music in a sentence that I want everything else to be quiet so I can hear the music of the sentence or the line. And so I don't know, I just find that other noises get in the way. I think that more and more people are able to read with noise. For some reason, I just can't. I see that some people are agreeing with me here. But then when I do show a draft to like the friend who's actually in town with me, and I show work to people who are far away, but when I get together with my friend in person, I then read to her out loud. And then I'll realize that I actually don't know how to pronounce a word that I've used. And I've read the poem to myself 20 times, didn't realize I didn't know how to pronounce that word. So that can be helpful. It does help.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you for your beautiful words and for this wonderful discussion. I've had a lot of fun. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this done with the record, and I hope everyone has a beautiful night. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Orca Books. Thank you for reading, poets. That was
Thank
amazing.
you.
Thanks,
Great
Blas.
night.
Thanks,
What a
Andrew.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
John.
Oh, thank you. So nice to
Bye,
meet you.
Ruby.